IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. For the first time ever, the prestigious Booker Prize was awarded to a translation of a Hindi novel, raising the profile not only of the book but also of the author and Hindi literature. Geetanjali Shree's original novel, Red Samadhi, which was translated as Tomb of Sand by Daisy Rockwell, was called a luminous novel of India and partition by the judges. What does this accolade mean for Indian writing, specifically in Hindi and in translation? What does it mean for other languages in India? And will this also suggest a boost for Hindi literature? Our guest today is Ashok Vajpeyi, himself a poet in Hindi, essayist and critic. Vajpeyi has published over 20 books of poetry and criticism and was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1994 for his poetry collection. He has also been a noted cultural and arts administrator and officer of the Indian Administrative Service and set up several cultural institutions, including Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal. In 2015, he was among the first writers to return his Sahitya Akademi Award in protest against the government's silence on violence against writers and the minorities. Ashok Vajpeyi, welcome to the Wire Talks. Geetanjali Shree's novel has won a major international award. What will the impact of this be on Hindi writing?
Well, there are two or three things which immediately occur to me. Firstly, this is a recognition that there is first-rate good writing in many Indian languages, including Hindi. Two, it also tries to correct the impression internationally created by English writing from India that it is the best and the most representative writing from India. Three, it raises the bar for translation, because translation, unfortunately, in India has not enjoyed the kind of prestige that it enjoys in the West. Fourthly, it brings into limelight the fact that, at least in Hindi, and I'm sure this is true about many other Indian languages, there is a very vibrant group of women writers writing poetry, fiction, non-fiction, etc. There are two aspects relating to translation. One is translation within Indian languages, and the other is translations from Indian languages into foreign languages. In terms of translation within Indian languages, Hindi is one of the most hospitable languages. The number of translations from other languages that take place in Hindi is quite enormous. The only sad point is that most of these translators are different language people learning Hindi and translating from their mother tongue into Hindi. The Hindi sort of persons do not readily or broadly learn other Indian languages to translate from those other Indian languages. But if you want to know what is happening in Indian literature in most of the languages, and if you are only a Hindi reading person, you would have a fairly wide and representative idea about the state of literature in India. The second aspect, that is about translations from Indian languages abroad, this might create a fillip there, in the sense that having learned that there is a language in which such a good novel has been written, they might feel more interested in getting works, let's say, from Marathi, Urdu, or Tamil, or Malayalam, etc., translated into English and other languages.
Is there a readership? Now, you say, for example, a terrific Malayalam novel, a novel in Malayalam is translated into Hindi. Is there a readership?
Well, there is a reasonable readership. In Hindi, readership itself is very limited. If you look at the numbers of the Hindi-speaking people, more than 40 crores, the number of books that get sold in Hindi is shamefully low. The Hindi reading habits have not grown. There is a middle class, a largest middle class of the country, but this is a middle class which has been constantly alienating itself from its own mother tongue. This is not the situation, for instance, in Bengali or Marathi or Malayalam or even Assamese. So thereby, there is a readership, but it's not a very large readership. However, publishing something in Hindi does make some kind of a rise in reputation of the book and the writer nationally. I would remind you that there was a time when, for instance, plays of Vijay Tendulkar, Badal Sarkar, Girish Karnad, they were all wonderful plays written in respective languages, but they attained a national reputation once they were translated into Hindi and produced in Hindi. And there were at that time many translations which took place of these plays, not from their original languages, but from Hindi. So Hindi into, say, Marathi, or Hindi into Bengali, whatever.
What has been generally speaking, the reaction of the Hindi literary world to Geetanjali Shree's victory?
Well, largely it has been welcome. Largely, people have felt happy, but there are always cynical writers everywhere. And those cynical, negative voices have also raised their head, as it were. Social media now becomes the forum where all kinds of people have all kinds of opinions. One of them, or at least some of them, saying that this is not a major Hindi novel. There have been it's true, it's not a major novel of the same, shall we say, magnitude or stature as works by Krishna Baldev Vaid or Vinod Kumar Shukla or Krishna Sopti or Nirmal Verma. And these major novels have been translated into English. But that hardly sort of matters. The point is, it is a good novel. It's an important novel, and it has been adjudged by an international jury. So obviously, the verdict, like all verdicts, will always be debatable. But this verdict is a positive verdict, and I think the Hindi literary world, by and large, is happy.
Yeah, that's somewhat encouraging. But curiously, the government, which is all for promoting Hindi and all for accepting any international accolade, including a reference in some magazine, positive reference in some magazine, and crows about it, has been completely muted and not said a word of congratulations.
Yes, on another occasion, I commented on it. At that time, they haven't said anything about Nikhat, this sports woman who won a world championship. There was no compliment given to her, but now, of course, they have made amends. But about this, well, you see, the point is that the novel is talking about limits and the sort of trying to exceed the limits, to push the limits, to destroy the limits, to demolish the limits. And this government, ideologically, is a government which has been very, very furiously busy creating all kinds of limitations, creating all kinds of borders. Now, how an anti-border novel winning an award can possibly be of interest to a party and to a system which is itself responsible for creating some of the most avoidable borders in our times, in our society.
Also, I seem to recall, references by Geetanjali Shree, articles, speeches, in which she has been pretty critical of what's going on in terms of not just limits and borders, but also the policies of this government. So, but you don't think that they want to promote Hindi, that they would be a little less, I don't want to use the word petty in such a forceful way, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yes. No, I wouldn't.
A bit big-hearted, a bit big-hearted.
Well, I would say they're being very petty-minded. One. Two, the so-called promotion of Hindi is also an empty statement. What have they done exactly to promote Hindi? Today, for the first time, one of the ministers, the education minister, has made a statement that there is no national language. All languages of this country are national languages. This is Mr. Whatever the name, Mr. Pradhan, or who's the education minister. He has said in connection with the national education policy. Now, this is for the first time that I hear this government acknowledge what is a fact. There is no national language. In the constitution, there's a national anthem, there's a national flag, there are national archives, and there's national museum. There have been national school of drama and such other national institution, but there has not been national language. And that is how it should be in a pluralistic country like India. Now, as for their concern for Hindi, have they done anything to promote interaction between Hindi and other languages? Have they taken any step or institutional step to bring the Indian languages together, to make them more efficient for purposes of education, for purposes of jurisprudence or knowledge production, this, that, and the other? If anything at all, they have systematically tried to destroy some of the important centers of knowledge production and ideas such as JNU, Jamia Millia, and the universities in the Hindi belt have more or less collapsed. Look at what happened in Allahabad, what happened to Patna. These were eminent universities, Sagar, etc. They have all, and the government is not even aware of it, if not exactly complicit in this destruction. So this is merely a slogan, and I suspect the slogan comes by making Hindi a language of Hindutva, which fortunately it is not. But if you look at the electronic media, if you look at the political debates that go on in Hindi, Hindi appears to be a language of hatred, a language of quarrels and disruptions, a language in which there are a lot of abuses to be inflicted on others, a language with others, many communities. Now, this is not the true nature of Hindi. Hindi literature today is firmly against these distortions of Hindi language.
Pushing Hindi, even in terms of rhetoric, which we understand, is dangerous in a country like India, isn't it? It can have dangerous fallout.
Yes, and already you see after these are like this government, particularly the forces of BJP, they start something, and then if they find that there is some resistance or is likely to create a negative fallout, they would keep quiet. They'll say nothing more about it. So you heard about Hindi a few months ago, and because it was attacked in Tamil Nadu or wherever, they keep quiet. They are no longer coming out with any explanation. As long as the cause of Hindi is promoted and seen to be promoted as against other Indian languages, or at least s- different from other Indian languages, it is bound to create this aggressive reaction. And there is no need. Hindi doesn't need that kind of a promotion. In fact, Hindi has spread in many parts of this country through cinema, through television. It has not spread through efforts of government. Even earlier governments have tried to do that, but it was not. And the Hindi that has been created for official purposes is a Hindi which nobody understands, including the officials who use it, because it is a dead, stale language away from the living idioms of Hindi.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with postcards from nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. That Sarkari Hindi, which I hear on flights and all that, and in circulars, is simply impossible to understand. So why not promote Hindustani, for example?
You see, first thing, I think the state should stop promoting. It has no business to promote. One, it is withdrawing from many more gainful activities. Why does it want to indulge in an activity which is not going to be gainful? One. Two, just as many bhaktas have become sort of daily historians on many historical events, so has many leaders, etc., have become spokesmen for Hindi. Now, Hindi doesn't need them. Hindi has enough important writers, enough important intellectuals, enough important people to speak for it. And Hindi will be nourished and promoted and sustained by the people, not by the state. Hindi has no experience of being ever promoted by the state in its history. And the Khadi Boli at one time, which is now the main dialect of Hindi, by which we understand Hindi, is Khadi because it was also supposed to be standing against power. So it doesn't need it. It had never enjoyed state patronage in a big way. And it had better not sort of crave for it. I don't know of any. There will always be people who will crave for it. The mediocre will always need the support or whatever. But the talented and the most substantial people don't.
The last time in the 60s when government tried to impose across the country, there were riots in Tamil Nadu, if you remember.
Yes.
So surely our present government has studied history, no? That it can have dangerous implications.
They are so busy creating history that they had no opportunity when they acquired their master's degree in entire political science. Perhaps history was not exactly one of the things that they had the occasion to go through. And mind you, language is a very emotional issue. Besides, it's a very cultural construct, and people sort of attain their identity through language. So language is an important issue. But because it is an important and emotional issue, it should keep the heavy hand of the state away.
Do you find that more and more families, more and more youngsters want to lean towards English because it's a language of economic opportunity, and that could have a detrimental effect on not just Hindi but other languages?
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, this is happening in a large way. And as I said, it is the middle classes which have these aspirational trends becoming more and more important for them, and that they, by and large, they are shifting. In fact, the problem of Hindi is more or less the problem of other Indian languages as well. Most Indian languages are in the in a crisis uh, in terms of uh, the linguistic skills and aspirations of their middle class children. They tend to think that. So the effort of the government, if at all, should be to make both Hindi and other Indian languages provide the same opportunity for aspirations as English does in this country. In other words, if in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, the largest number of crimes take place, the largest number of violent acts and murders and rapes and take place, if the largest amount of unemployment in these states, if the largest number of people have yet to uh, taste the fruits of development, then how can you expect that a language alone will? But in the promotion of Hindi, the current promotion of Hindi, I see a subtle attempt to give to the Hindi-speaking state another toy. We have given you a temple, we have given you the Hindu, we have given you, and now we give you Hindi. So these are attempts to conceal or to take you away from the real issues which impinge on your life and livelihood.
But do you see a future, because Hindi cinema and now Hindi films on OTT platforms are doing really well? The Hindi channels do better than English channels. Do you see a future for the language if correctly managed?
Yes, I mean, I don't think that a language can. I'm reminded of what the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky once said about Anna Akhmatova, a great Russian poet who had to suffer during the Soviet regime, and she said, but finally, Anna Akhmatova will survive because language is more ancient than the state. I think what you're asking me is this. Language is more ancient than state, and therefore there are these other possibilities which have opened up. And if they are treated properly with human empathy, with visions and dreams which are already entrenched in their traditions, are allowed to bloom forth. And if this language, or for that matter, any other language, is made to be a language of aspiration, not only as expression, then there is a future. Maybe this is an optimism of a writer who has spent 60 years writing. And I don't want to feel that sooner or later I may be forgotten and thrown into the dustbin by history for other causes, but not because I wrote in Hindi.
Yeah, that's very well put. But on a personal note, I must say that at a particular time in my younger days, I read Premchand and Yashpal in Hindi. And just now, I have Geetanjali Shree's novel in the original and Rockwell's translation, Daisy's translation. But I'm afraid I'll be leaning towards that because I haven't, perhaps I can speak it, but I perhaps lost a little bit of that easy fluidity. So I'm very, very happy about your optimism, and may that optimism continue. So that was a hopeful note to end this discussion on the Ashok Vajpeyi. Is with us, telling us that Hindi is not going to be a dead language. And now with events like Geetanjali, with really, really milestones like Geetanjali Shree winning a Booker Prize, and no doubt there are languages, writing in languages in India which are really, really evocative, and they need to be brought to the notice of a wider readership, that Hindi and Hindi writing and the language, not just of expression, but also, as he pointed out very perceptibly, aspiration, will continue. And there is a long way before it's going to be wiped out. But again, to just sum up, Ashok Vajpeyi has also told us the government should get out of the way and not do promotion. So thank you, Ashok Vajpeyi, for this wonderful conversation. I think it will, I'm afraid we had to do it in English, but it will reach particular audience. So I suppose it's a good thing as long as communication is maintained.
Thank you.
With that, we come to the end of this episode of the Wire Talk. We'll be back once again next week with another guest from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks team. Goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Hello, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcasts Network. On the Filter Coffee podcast, India Film Project founder Ritam Bhatnagar shares his thoughts on the creator movement with Karthik. On the Wire Talks, Sidharth and Professor Sasanka Pereira talk about the current crisis in Sri Lanka. On Smarter with Sid, Sidharth explores the two different approaches to management, top-down and bottom-up. On Say No to Drama, Chetna explains how spirituality is not devoid of logic. And on Marathi Khidkitun, the Deshmukhs admire the works of multifaceted Marathi author Gopal Nilkant Dandekar. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcasts has just launched its merch and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcasts website and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, Capgemini, get the future you want, Intel V Pro, built for business, and Intel, future banao wonderful with Intel powered laptops.